topic, Black community. Let's think of what we're talking about when we say community, first of all. And so a community really is, it involves a sense of belonging, a shared responsibility. It's the glue that holds a group together. And so if we look at the Black community, we can see the term Black is referring to a group of people that have a specific kind of historical experience, who are primarily descended from the African continent, who came here to the United States in slavery, who experienced Jim Crow segregation, and has continued to struggle with institutional racism. And so this group has constantly had to bond together and work together to overcome slavery, to overcome Jim Crow segregation, and to overcome institutional racism. And so there is a sense of unified belonging, a sense of cohesiveness that surrounds this common struggle that Black people have experienced. And when we look at this, we also see that there is a sense of shared responsibility. And even though there's disagreements and conflicts internally and all of those things, there's this sense of shared responsibility, because Black people have been constantly involved in trying to figure out how to solve this problem of racism and this problem of being marginalized and discriminated against and being suppressed and oppressed. And this is a issue that has been a bond for Black Americans ever since Black Americans came into this country. And in addition to that, it also defines a global Black community. It's had similar experiences in addressing and dealing with the issue of global racism and worldwide white supremacy. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this as a context, I want to address a couple of things, I think, to set the background a little better. If you go and examine in the field of biology, they have classification systems. They have a classification system, and it talks about the various different categories of how man is categorized, and man is known as Homo sapien, a species. He's a Homo sapien, and you go through the structure that they use in the classification system. At the top of it, man is part of what's called, where they have what they call the kingdom and phylum, class, order, genus, species, etc. Well, in the kingdom, man is part of the kingdom Animalia. In other words, man is an animal. He shares the same characteristics in terms of, he's a biological creature, and he's classified as distinguished from, say, the plant kingdom. He's not a plant, he's an animal. He's not bacteria, he's not other forms of life on earth. As a form of life, man is what is called part of the kingdom Animalia. And so man is, in fact, an animal. But the distinguishing thing that separates man, say, from a pack of wolves or a pride of lions or a herd of sheep or other groupings of animals that form communities, that are part of a community in nature, is that man has the capacity for spiritual development and has the capacity to think and to reason. And so this sets man apart and sets man above animals in the regular animal kingdom. And of course, there's been debate about whether or not there should be a separate category for man, that man is actually more than just an animal. He has a spiritual nature. He is a spiritual being. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this distinction, we have a physical body that exists in the kingdom Animalia, but we also have a spiritual body that exists in the spiritual world, that we have intelligence, we have knowledge, we have the ability to communicate and to cross great distances by the use of our minds and our intelligence. And so in looking at this concept and understanding the nature of spirituality, that man is a spiritual being, in terms of looking at and understanding this, it becomes very significant to understand a concept that that Martin Luther King talks about in his book called Strength to Love. And he talks about the beloved community. And so in terms of looking at like the beloved community, what is the beloved community? What was Dr. Martin Luther King talking about when he talked about the beloved community? And he was talking about a society based on justice, based on equal opportunity and love for one's fellow human beings. And he went on and to try to describe this as that he's not talking about a utopian dream. And he makes this distinction to be clear that, yeah, we can have this ideal, this vision that in essence is a utopian dream, but he's not talking about a utopian dream when he talks about the beloved community. He's talking about a shared commitment to resolving conflict and caring for one another and working things out mutually in order to make the world a better place. And so when you think about it in this context, I want you to think for a minute that when we engage in wars and we engage in activities that say, for example, we go and we bomb another country. And when we bomb that country, let's say that their leaders are taken out or people we dislike and all those kinds of things. But in the process, you look at the number of civilian casualties. You look at the number of civilians whose families are affected and people that are damaged as a result of our desire to get what we want. And what happens is we create new generations of enemies, people who grow up and they remember what happened to their sisters and brothers, to their mothers and fathers, and to their children or their siblings, and and their family members. They recognize that it was Americans that dropped that on them. And so you have this generation sometime go by that they nurture a hatred toward people that they perceive as their enemy. Someone who, because they had advantage, because they had a bomb, or because they had the technology, that they in fact abused that technology, because instead of effectively addressing the situation, they came in and inflicted damage and they hurt innocent people. And so this damage to innocent people, this damage to people who did not have the power to change things, those people who weren't in a position to really do anything, and who in many cases were suffering themselves, that casualties are inflicted upon them and damage is inflicted upon them. And when you began to look at this concept, Dr. Martin Luther King really began to try to address this and try to help us understand the significance and importance of being able to have this level and quality of insight, this level and quality of understanding of some of the basic fundamental issues that impact human relationships. And so there's this. He published this book in 1963 entitled "Strength to Love," and many people, I talk to about Dr. Martin Luther King, and I find they've never really read Dr. King's book "Strength to Love," and they've never really studied it. And in terms of some of the discussion that I've run into recently, just made me feel that it's necessary to talk about Dr. King and Dr. King's book, particularly the book entitled "Strength to Love." And in it, what he does is he outlines the spiritual and moral framework required to combat injustice without resorting to hatred. And so what he's doing, he's pointing out the fact that, he's saying that we have to have a tough mind and a tender heart. We have to have the mind to be able to understand and recognize things like, for example, racism. We have to be able to understand and recognize when we are discriminated against. We need to have a tough mind to be able to recognize and see and have the courage to stand up when wickedness is taking place, when evil is taking place, and we're being abused, and when our communities are being abused and damaged. We have to have the tough-mindedness to be able to stand up to that. We have to have the tough-mindedness to understand it, to be able to see it, and to be able to call it out. So we have to have the strength of mind. But he also points out that we have to have a tender heart. And by having empathy and compassion, because sometimes when we look at a situation and we see someone who's acting out, who's doing evil, they're on a path of destruction, that very often when we look at them, we see a troubled spirit. We see a spirit that has been damaged somewhere along the way, and that people are acting out because of something that happened to them in the past, or because of some system of belief that has been presented to them and that they bought into, even though the belief may be a false belief. It may be based in prejudice. It may be based in myths. And so Dr. King tried to point out some of these things to show, for example, when you see people acting in white supremacy, who are committing atrocities against black people, who are fighting to prevent black people from having civil rights and basic human rights, and they deny basic decency, that they demonstrate that they don't have any decency as human beings, that sometimes when you look at them, what you find is that they are inflamed and inspired by myths, by lies, by disinformation and half-truths that cause them to have prejudice. And Dr. King pointed out, for example, he talked about Aryan supremacy. He talked about the Teutonic origins theory, and he talked about the Piltdown Scholar scandal. And he talked about some of those things that promoted the ideal of white supremacy and reinforced this ideal of white supremacy and gave certain groups of people who did not have the capacity to see past it. They didn't have the intellectual capacity to understand it, how they were inflamed by it. And that they began to see black people as an enemy. They began to see black people as a threat. They began to see black people in a negative light. Why? Because of disinformation. In many cases, this disinformation was being promoted purposely to them in order to put them against black people, to put them against other groups of people, in order to benefit someone who was seeking an advantage for themselves and who was willing to sacrifice and damage everyone else. And so Dr. King pointed out this having a tough mind and a tender heart. And he went on to talk about the power of agape love. And that is not an emotional love, but a selfless love, a sense of the brotherhood of humanity. And he talked about how this was something that is required in order to truly defeat evil in the world, in order to reconcile man together. So that in order to reconcile man together, we have to be able to have a tough mind and a tender heart, and we have to be able to act with agape love, this unselfish kind of love, this love that actually embraces the brotherhood of humanity and that seeks to establish the beloved community. And this is a theme that Dr. King worked on, that he focused on, and that he attempted to teach about so that people could grow and develop the kinds of consciousness that could ultimately make America a better place, that could establish America as a beacon on the hill, that could establish America as a place of universal brotherhood, that where everyone would have an equal opportunity, and that communities could grow and flourish and develop here. And so he talked about and he taught about nonviolent resistance. And one of the things in talking about nonviolent resistance is he talked about nonviolent resistance is it's not a do nothing type of position. And it's not something that is for cowards. It actually takes more strength. It takes you being more tough minded in order to carry out nonviolent resistance and to be able to resist the impulse to punch him in the mouth, to resist the impulse to respond violently, to resist that impulse. And so this is what he talks about, the courage to confront evil without becoming evil yourself. And this was the challenge that he put forth, to talk about our growth and development. In order to make progress, we have to win souls. We have to reconcile the brotherhood of humanity. We have to reconcile other groups of people to ourselves. And so he talked about the interdependence of humanity and the inescapable network of mutuality, and the fact that we are all tied together in a web of humanity, that we're interdependent on each other. And if you look around the world, you can go in your kitchen and just look in your cabinets, and you'll see products from all over the world. Whether it's your spices or whether it is various different food products. When you go through your house and say there's a washing machine or there's a stove or refrigerator, the whole world was involved in producing these products. That materials come from various places, and the parts and the technology. And when you look at all of these systems that came together to produce that refrigerator, even though it might be manufactured in China or manufactured in the United States or manufactured in some other country, it is the culmination in product of a collective global effort. And in terms of looking at it and understanding, and even like looking at the washing powder you put in, where did it come from? That we are in an inescapable network of mutuality. And in order for mankind to move forward, for humanity to move forward, we have to recognize this interdependence that we have on each other. And we have to also recognize not only the interdependence that we have on each other, but the kinds of damages that can be done to each other to cause chaos and damage the relationships and damage the potential of the development of the beloved community. And so in terms of looking at this, Dr. King focused on the ideal of faith in the face of fear. And he looked at fear as an elemental alarm system of the human organism. It's natural. Fear is natural. But he also focused on the fact that faith has to overcome fear, and that perfect love, that agape love, overcomes fear because you act with a purpose. You understand the nature of things, and you function with a purpose, and you don't act and recoil in fear and operate in fear. You operate in purpose. And so he focused on this ideal and how that in order to move in faith, we also have to recognize and understand the nature of forgiveness. We have to learn to understand how to build permanent relationships. In other words, how do we build permanent mutual relationships of respect and love and brotherhood? And how do we work toward building this harmonious community? And so this was a theme that Dr. King started out with in his book called Strength to Love in 1963. And this motivated him in terms of his whole ministry, his whole mission of what he was attempting to do. And I want to point out one other book that Dr. King wrote that I think is extremely important. And I'd encourage everyone to go and pick up a copy of Strength to Love and read Strength to Love and read about what Dr. King talked about and what he was talking about in his book entitled Strength to Love that was published in 1963. But he wrote another book that was published, and I think this was his last book that he wrote, and it was entitled Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And he published this book in 1967. And one of the things about this book was what he was doing was going back and looking at the civil rights movement and the progress made so far in the civil rights movement. And he looked at this and identified that we were at that point in a pivotal shift in terms of that they had worked and struggled to desegregate lunch counters. They desegregated the buses. They desegregated public parks and public spaces. And they made a major effort, regionalized in different places, in order to advance the agenda of building the beloved community. And so in terms of looking at this, he focused on the fact that we've made major progress in these areas, but we have another phase to go to. In other words, that this is just the beginning. And so, in the beginning, his whole ministry was about securing voting rights and securing basic civil rights, ending legal segregation and discrimination against Black people from a legal standpoint. And he described this as the easier struggle. And he talked about going into this second phase. And this is where he's at. Where do we go from here? And this second phase is, he talked about it requires a radical reconstruction of society to address deep-seated economic inequality, and that legislation is insufficient. And so Dr. King focused on the issues of poverty and racism and militarism as what he identified as the three evils, racism, poverty, and militarism. And so in terms of looking at this, what Dr. King focused on in his book, he talked about Black power, and he admired the sentiment of Black power and Black people standing up for themselves. And he was very clear in understanding that Black power is necessary. But he also cautioned about Black separatism, because you can have Black power without having Black separatism and promoting Black separatism, because we live in a world of mutuality. In other words, we're not isolated and we're not separate and apart. We are part of humanity, and we are part of the fabric of humanity. And so the ideal of separatism, that Black power, that we need Black power, but we don't need Black separatism. And Black separatism, in the sense, is that we will isolate ourselves and completely disavow everyone else and separate ourselves from everyone else. Because by isolating ourselves, we do not live in a separate world. We live in a world of mutuality. We live in a world where, the washing machine was actually, parts of it came from all parts of the world. The food on our table when we sit down to dinner comes from multiple places. And it's already demonstrated that it's pretty much unrealistic that you're going to produce everything that you are going to consume. And in fact, if if you want to go back to that stage, that's a step backwards in humanity. And that the vast majority of the 8.3 billion people in the world cannot do that. They're not going to be able to produce everything that they consume. That no man is an island. We are not separate and distinct and apart where we cannot, where we're never going to interact with other people. And the ideal that we could do this is an irrational and illogical ideal. And Dr. King has pointed out the fact that we need Black power. We need Black community. We need Black organization. And we could even be a separate Black nation, but not be separate and isolated from the rest of the world. And I think it's important for us to understand that distinction that Dr. King was making, because he pointed out that the whole ideal of Black separatism, where you make everybody else your enemies, that is self-defeating and self-destructive. And so he pointed out and cautioned about that, and that focused on the danger of doing that and developing that kind of mentality, because it becomes really a reaction to past discrimination. We've been discriminated against so much in this country and suffered so many atrocities that there's a tendency for some Black people to say, I'm done with it. I don't want anything to do with anybody else, any other groups of people. They all try to take advantage of us. They all try to, but in reality, we need to be able to interact with other people and have mutual relationships, because we live in a world that's interdependent. And so in terms of King encouraged coalition building, that Black communities need to have autonomy. They need to have Black power. They need to have all these things, but he encouraged coalition building, so that because different communities also have common interests and have to bond together to work together, because we live in a world where mutuality, where it's inevitable. It's inescapable. We're in an inescapable network of mutuality. And so Dr. King recognizes this. He also challenges, at that point, he challenged the YT liberals, and he accused them of being more committed to order than they are to justice. And so he focused on really attempting to educate them about justice, to recognize justice, is that sometimes that it's more about order than it is, about anything else. It's like that order sometimes has to take a second place to justice, because order won't stay order long as there's being injustices committed against people, and that people are living in a system of tyranny and injustice, and their rights are being violated, and they're being discriminated against, and they're being excluded from opportunities, and they're being trampled on their rights, and their families are being torn apart, and their children are being denied opportunities, and they're being suppressed from progress. That justice has to prevail, and that justice sometimes outweighs order, and that order sometimes has to take a back seat to justice, and then order reestablished so that justice can prevail. And so in his discussion and talk about the beloved community, Dr. King focused on the need to develop this global solidarity. And he talked about the human rights revolution. And during this time, when he wrote this book in 1967, the African liberation movement was full scale. There was about 40 independent African countries that had emerged by that time. Dr. King himself went to the inauguration of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in 1957, when Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was inaugurated as the first independent Black president of Ghana. And then he also visited some other inaugurations. And you see that during that particular time, you see after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had been passed by the United Nations in 1948, a human rights revolution came into being all across the world. And you had the Bandung Conference in 1955 held in Indonesia. And at that time, W.E.B. Du Bois had been banned from international travel. He was held hostage in the United States by his own government to try to silence him. They revoked his passport. And so he couldn't personally attend, but he sent a document that was a proposed African Declaration of Independence. And he proposed, this was in 1955, he proposed this Declaration of African Independence. And then 2 years later, Ghana becomes an independent African nation. And then you have Guinea and Nigeria, and you have a proliferation of black countries now emerging, arising from the ashes of colonialism, arising from the oppression that started long ago and that culminated in the Berlin Conference of 1884, when Africa was divided among European nations into colonial territories. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding this, when Dr. King, when he said that also in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done in a hurry to bring the colored peoples of the world out of their long years of poverty and out of their long years of urban neglect, the whole world is doomed. And he went on to talk about this, to point out the fact that what we're talking about is a global worldwide revolution. And if you really understand the history of what was going on and understand the context of the Black civil rights movement in America, it was done within the context of a global human rights revolution. And many people that don't understand that, they don't really understand the history, or they're not able to contextualize it because we just don't get the information from the school system, doesn't teach us the actual history. And so this is why it's important for us to talk about it now. But in his book entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, Dr. King tried to set out the paths forward so that we can see the alternatives and see the differences in terms of to be able to make the right choice. And he talked about economic injustice as one of the major themes. And when you look at this, Dr. King, he pointed out that, we didn't get 40 acres and a mule after slavery. And of course, the YT community had multiple generations, generation after generation, had the capacity to accumulate wealth and pass it down to the next generation and build infrastructure and build the capacity to progress economically. But Black people were enslaved. They were chattel. They produced wealth for YT people. And then at the end of slavery, they weren't given 40 acres and a mule. They weren't given land to cultivate. And he talked about how the government was willing to undergird the YT peasants from Europe with an economic floor. In other words, they gave them massive amounts of land. They gave them resources and means to get started and tools to get started. And they did this for YT immigrants. They even did this for people who were former slave masters. They got paid for the loss of their property, their alleged property. But Black people were released from slavery, released from years of bondage, multi-generational bondage. They were released from slavery with nothing. And so he describes this, as saying that, the Black people were released to the winds of poverty, to the winds of oppression. We were released from slavery and put in a position, an impossible situation, while others were given an undergirded with an economic floor, and that black people were put in a position of suffering. And the 19th century economic philosopher Henry George described it as saying that in order to take a man and say, you are now free and at liberty, you got your freedom, you're free now. And to do that to someone where all the land is appropriated as the property of others would be no different than taking that man and taking him and dropping him in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and saying, okay, you're now free and at liberty to swim ashore. Most of the people are not going to make it. There may be a few that figure out how to float and figure some innovative way to survive, but the vast majority will drown. And that's what happened to black people at the end of the Civil War. Black people were put in precisely this exact situation, this described by the economic philosopher Henry George, that's described by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his book, Strength to Love. And this explains the wealth gap that you see. This explains poverty in the black community. So black people weren't poor because they were lazy, because they didn't want to work, because they were shiftless. These were myths cultivated and created to defame and denigrate black people. The reality of the experience was that black people worked from can't see in the morning to can't see at night for generation after generation and established wealth for YT people. And then they were freed and they didn't have a place to go. They didn't have any place to live. They didn't own anything. They came out of poverty. They came out of slavery directly into abject poverty. And so Dr. King pointed out the situation and pointed out the fact that this poverty that exists, that it is one of those evils, and that racism that produced this situation to put black people in poverty is also one of these major evils. And so he describes these three evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. And he discusses these and about how these are things that have to be overcome in order for us to make progress. And Dr. King spoke out on the war in Vietnam. And of course, when we actually studied Dr. King recognized St. Augustine's work. He talked often about St. Augustine. And he talked about the fact that, when he talked about the Vietnam War, many black people just simply didn't analyze what Dr. King was saying. Many people thought, well, he was just talking about the war is unjust and evil and, all those kinds of things. But what Martin Luther King was talking about was Martin Luther King not only was just opposing war generally, the fact of the matter is that racism was prevalent in the U.S. military, and that Dr. King was aware of the reports, and he was aware of what was going on, and he was speaking out because the military, you had about 11% of the military was black people, equal to the population of black people. So black people were well represented. In fact, in many areas, they were overrepresented in the military. So you had a lot of black people in the military, and 11% of the soldiers, about 12% of the military personnel were black people. But black Americans were over 25% of the casualties of the people that were unalived in Vietnam. And when you look at what was happening, there were all kinds of incidents that were taking place. As a matter of fact, at one point, the military had to ban Confederate flags because you had people flying Confederate flags at U.S. military bases and using Confederate symbolism, connected to their uniforms even. And this was, there was so much racism within. You think about the fact that you had people blocking the schoolroom doors and lynching black people and unaliving Medgar Evers and and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And you look at all the kinds of atrocities that were going on against black people in civil society in America. And then think of what was actually going on in Vietnam, where black men had to stand alongside of white men in a war theater. What they were doing was they were sending black men to the front line to die. And that's why black men disproportionately were unalived in the war. We're 25, they're half, it's like more than double their representation as soldiers were unalive. The casualty rate, 25% of the casualties. And when you began to take a look at what was going on there were no black officers. There was blatant discrimination against black people. And there's actually all kinds of reports and information. If you go back and you really want to study what happened during that time, there's just a robust amount of information because there was all kinds of studies. There were trials. Black people were disproportionately put into brig. They were disproportionately disciplined. And what would happen is, for example, things like black people developed what they called the DAP handshake. And black people were literally put in a brig in some discharge from the military because of a handshake, a cultural handshake. And at the same time, their YT counterparts were flying Confederate flags from flagpoles that should have had an American flag. And the black people were being discharged from the military or being disciplined or put in Leavenworth or put in the brig or jailed because of a handshake, a cultural handshake. And this was the kind of thing that was going on in the military at this time. So when Dr. King began to speak out against the war, there's a lot of depth to it that you never really hear getting discussed of what was actually happening to black people in Vietnam. And you had black men pushed to the front line so that they were the highest casualty rates. And they were coming back from the war maimed and crippled, on drugs and in all kinds of adverse situations. Some blacks were pushed to leave, to desert, and go live in Laos and Cambodia and other places because of the treatment that they received at the hands of YT officers and other YT soldiers who came up in segregation, who supported segregation, who came up with views of Aryan supremacy in the Teutonic origins theory and the Piltdown scholar, and who thought they were better than black people, who thought that they were entitled to more than black people, who saw black people as less than themselves. And they practice open discrimination. Now you hear stories about, how, this bonding the soldiers together made everyone come together. And that might be true to some degree. And that may have happened in some instances. But there's a robust record of the opposite. There's a robust record of the troubled times that black soldiers went through, that black soldiers suffered under, and the conditions that they had to suffer under during the Vietnam War. And so a lot of folk don't want to talk about that. They don't want to address those realities. And so this is something that Dr. King focused on when he talks about some of this. And where do we go from here? Chaos or community? You got all these black men coming back from Vietnam, but you don't have any post-traumatic stress disorder treatment for them. Some of them are coming back homeless. Some of them are coming back, they're shell-shot, and they are suffering such that they're really not positioned to take care of themselves. They end up homeless on the streets. They end up in all kinds of negative and adverse situations because you mistreated them and you took them for granted and you marginalized them and you just simply have abused them. And so Dr. King is bringing attention to that. And of course, the powers that be, they didn't want me to bring the attention to that. One of the other things the book talks about is the psychological roots of racism. And this, when we look at this, I think this is one of the really big ones that he started this discussion on. And that is being able to look at and understand the psychological roots of racism, and to be able to go back and look at the mythology that created this phenomena and social construct of race, in the sense that it's done in a negative way, to be able to view one race as superior to others, and to be able to look at black people with disdain, and to be able to place in the minds of YT people a justification for committing evil against black people, a justification for marginalizing black people, a justification for violating the human rights of black people, a justification for violating the civil rights and the voting rights, the economic rights of black people. And that Dr. King focused on the fact that we have to look at the psychological roots of racism. We have to look at it and understand it and turn it upside down. We've got to explore the Aryan supremacy theory and debunk it and show that it's a false doctrine. It's built on mythology and lies and disinformation. We have to look at the so-called Teutonic origins theory and recognize that it's a lie, that it's built on disinformation. It's designed to inflame and to divide. You look at this situation in 1947, Arnold Toynbee appeared on the cover of Time magazine as the Man of the Year. And Arnold Toynbee was a British historian, and he wrote a 12-volume set called A Study of History. And in this study of history, he proclaimed that black people, that he studied 21 civilizations around the world, and that black people made, the quote unquote Negro, made no creative contribution to any of the 21 civilizations around the world that he studied. And this is something he published and got placed on the cover of Time magazine for this 12-volume set, supposedly built upon this ideal of universal history. And it was a way to try to permanently damage black people and suggest that black people never achieved anything, and that we've never contributed to society, that we are always a burden to society. And so enslavement and racial segregation, that all these things are justified. Why? Because we've never contributed anything to society. We've never built anything, and we're just merely a burden on society. We're not even fully developed as human beings. And this concept was put forward as an ideal and was promoted, and the man who did it got put on Time magazine cover as the Man of the Year. This was the mentality that existed. And this is the environment that Dr. King was preaching in. He was in this environment opposing and preaching against this kind of mentality, against this wickedness, these lies, this evil that was being promoted. And so in terms of looking at and going back, and Dr. King, he put in context, and he said that if I were standing at the beginning of time, and kind of had a general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, he said, I would take my mental flight by Egypt. And it's significant because if you go back and look at ancient Egypt and go back and study and examine, for example, Martin Delany, the writings of Martin Delany, and look at Professor Cheikh Anta Diop's book entitled The African Origin of Civilization. Look at Black Man of the Nile and Its Family by Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan. Go back and look at the works of various scholars, including Dr. Martin Delany, who published The Origin of Races and Colors in 1879. He was the highest black military officer, Major Martin Delany, in the Civil War. And he actually traveled to Africa and established a treaty to establish an independent nation for black people so that black people could leave America and start their own country on the African continent. So when we go back and take a look at Dr. Martin Delany and look at all of the different people, the writers, in terms of going back and look from pre-dynastic times to the beginning of the 14th dynasty, was indigenous black Africans, the group of people that they would call Negroes, that Arnold Toynbee would call Negroes. And you go back and you look at the data and you look at the evidence and examine the evidence closely, in which you discover that the high culture of ancient Egypt, the prototype of modern human civilization, started among black people, and that black people developed the numerical system that we have now. They developed multiple different writing scripts, the hieroglyph, the hieroglyph, the despotic, the Meroic scripts. They developed the first medical text, where Imhotep was considered he was a multi-genius in ancient Egypt, and he's responsible for medical texts with 750 plants in their medicinal use. He's also responsible for studies of the treatment of abscesses and burns, of the pulse and circulation, studies in gynecology, and studies in a number of different systems of the human body. And he is later deified under the Greek name Asclepius. And he's worshipped as the god of medicine in ancient Greece. Hippocrates, whom modern physicians now recite the Hippocratic Oath, and Hippocrates is reciting Imhotep. He's talking about Asclepius, the god of medicine. And so in terms of borrowing culture and understanding the contributions that black people made, Arnold Toynbee was a fraud, but they put him on the cover of Time magazine. And perhaps the editors for Time magazine couldn't distinguish the facts. They just moved with the propaganda. And so in terms of the propaganda of white supremacy. But Dr. King was pointing out and trying to show us the fact that we don't war against flesh and blood. We're warring against spiritual wickedness. We're dealing with evil in the nature of people. We're talking about a battle between good and evil. And so in terms of looking at this, that it's in the spiritual nature where the battle is taking place. And that and fundamentally, man is an animal. He's driven by his drives and instincts and his urges and his passions and his hunger. But man who's fully developed, the spiritual man, overcomes those things, overcomes the flesh, suppresses the flesh, and is able to manage the flesh. And so to reach this higher level of consciousness, and this is part of what Dr. King is talking about. He's talking about the whole society growing and the whole society developing spiritually. And so Dr. King gave an example of Christ. They threatened him, they called him and ridiculed him, and and they tried to call him a communist and all those kinds of things, right? And he told him, he said, I read Das Kapital in the Communist Manifesto years ago when I was a student in college. He said, I didn't get my revolutionary inspiration from Karl Marx. I got it from a man named Jesus, a Galilean. And so he went on to talk about that and clarify and distinguish the fact that man has to overcome his wicked nature, his physical urges and desires. And we have to build a harmonious community. We have to build the beloved community. The beloved community won't just automatically come into existence. It's not pie in the sky. It's not something that's utopian. It's a practical reality that has to be realized, that has to be created by us, by man who's here on the ground. We have to build it. We have to take the time to develop ourselves and develop our spiritual understanding and develop our understanding of the relationships between each other so that we can build that harmonious community. And so those were the three main principles that Dr. King focused on in his book entitled Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And he talked about the economic injustice that Black people are suffering under. You see that there's a wealth gap. The average YT family has from 13 to 17 times the accumulated wealth of the average Black family. And this has deep historical roots. And it has to do with structured inequality. It has to do with a system of racism that put these things into position to create the condition that you see that exists today. And that this inequality, this wealth gap, is a consequence of past conduct, of past structuring, of past racism targeting Black people. And that we have to be able to recognize this and understand it in order to effectively address it going forward, to bring about change and improve the conditions that exist in the world today. And so he also talked about Vietnam, and not just generally about about war and the damage that war does to people, especially to the innocent people. But he also talked about the fact that Black people were being unalived at twice the rate, that Black people were being pushed to the front line out of sheer racism, and that Black soldiers were suffering from inequality, from racial discrimination, from hatred and bigotry, and that these were this was going on as part of this whole process of this war, and it has to stop. Not only is it destructive to other peoples around the world, but it destroys the Black community. It's destroying young Black men at an alarming rate. And Dr. King also focused on the psychological roots of racism and how we have to understand the roots of racism, its origin, where it comes from, and how it maintains itself in order to overcome it. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding this whole ideal of Black community, there are about 46.9 million or more people that are classified as Black or African American in the United States today. And when we look at this community was protected because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the host of federal regulations that grew out of the Civil Rights Act that implemented these civil rights across federal programs in the Department of Education, in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, in the Department of the Interior, in the Department of Defense, in the Department of Energy, and in a host of federal agencies that these regulations were developed, and they were involved in federal acquisition regulations in terms of contracting and being able to do business with the federal government. And there's a host of areas that are impacted that these civil rights laws leveled the playing field from a legal standpoint to open the door of opportunity for Black people, for women, and for other so-called minority groups in the United States so that they could have an equal access, and it wouldn't be an exclusive YT men's club and only YT men, and privileged YT men at that, had the advantage and the opportunity and everyone else was excluded. That those days were all over, and the civil rights movement brought that about. It took Black people marching in the streets. It took building coalitions and alliances and building allies with other groups of people within the society in order to get these laws passed and open these doors of opportunity, which open the door for many groups of people. And so when we take a look at this effort of this regime of civil rights laws that were established throughout the federal government, when we look at the Voting Rights Act, how on Edmund Pettus Bridge, people were attacked by state police, 600 black marchers. There was all kinds of atrocities committed against black people. And we look at the struggle that black people went through for voting rights and how black voting rights were attacked since blacks got the privilege to vote. First black men in 1870, and then later with the 15th Amendment, and then with the 19th Amendment, women got the right to vote, including black women. And how all through this period, there's a effort to suppress the black vote, to suppress the woman vote, and to attempt to maintain a system of white male power structure and hierarchy. That this whole system that was in place, that black people marched and demonstrated to open the door so that everyone would have an opportunity to participate in American society. And America achieved its greatest achievements under this regime of laws, under this system, opened the door of opportunity, and it brought in people through the Immigration Act, the Naturalization Act of 1965, where people of color were excluded historically from immigration into the United States. What happened is you now had an unprecedented number of people coming to the United States. So you've got people coming here from foreign countries like Nigeria and Ghana and South Africa who are physicians, doctors. You have a shortage of black doctors in America. They're coming in from Nigeria and from Ghana, from South Africa, black physicians coming in. In addition to that, you have Asians coming in from China and from India, from other parts of the world, from South Korea, from Japan, coming in who are scientists and who half of the PhDs in the United States are foreigners. And they bring a brain trust to America that strengthens America and is the foundation of America's success. It has built the industrial base and the industrial power and helped promote and develop the U.S. economy. And so these structures have been put in place, and that it was a struggle to put these in place. And if you look at the role black people played, black people opened the door to make these things possible. And if we look at this and truly understand it, and we have to recognize and acknowledge the role that black people have played in promoting, bringing about the beloved community in America, we now see an effort to dismantle that. We see black scientists, and we see Asian scientists, and we see other foreign scientists from Asian countries, and they're being expelled from the country because of this misguided understanding in terms of immigration, this desire to promote white supremacy, this so-called great replacement theory, this fear that foreigners and other people will replace white men in the power of white men. And so this fear and this disinformation and this lie that's being promoted is tearing the country apart today. It is dismantling the actual power base that has made America have success. They're dismantling it step by step and destroying America. And this is what we're witnessing today. This is what we are seeing today. You know, and when we take a look at this, there has always been some type of social contract between America and the various communities that have come here. And you've had Italian communities come here. You've had Polish communities come here. You've had Jewish communities come here. You've had Irish communities come here to America. You've had English communities come to America, and Swedish communities, and Dutch communities, and Portuguese communities. You've had various different Latin American communities. You've got Somali communities. You've got Filipino communities. America is it's a quilt. It is a multitude of different groups of people who live in a society working together to build the harmonious society, to build the beloved community. And so when we began to really take a look at this, we all have social contracts with America. And these social contracts often are unwritten, but it's like, what is our relationship to America? What is our relationship to the American society? What do we bring to the table? What is our role? And if you look at Black America came as slaves. They were enslaved. Black people were then under Jim Crow segregation. And then Black people have continued to be subject to institutional racism. And in spite of the fact that Black people have struggled in order to preserve America and to improve America and build America and to become productive and effective members of American society, there's always this pushback, this attempt at marginalization, to this attempt to destroy Black people and set Black people back, to create confusion in the Black community and to damage the Black community. And it's been constant since Black people came to America. And one of the things that the Dr. King pointed out in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, is he focused also on the necessity of repentance and reconciliation. And when we look at, in order for America to survive, not for just America to move forward, but for America to survive, there has to be some repentance on the part of certain groups of people in this country. And that without that repentance, and they continue in the way that they're going forward, judgment has to be certain. Judgment has to come. Because at what point do you look at it and say, well, they didn't understand, they didn't grow, and they have to learn, and let's help them learn, let's help them understand, and we'll work with them. And at what point do you have to look at it and say that it is no longer an issue that they don't fully understand choice? It's no longer an issue that they are immature. It's no longer an issue about their growth and development. The real fact of the matter is that their nature is evil, and that their choice is evil, and that they are committed to evil. And what happens when we get to that point? What happens when we recognize that evil is real? What do we do when we recognize the threat that this evil actually presents, not just to Black people, but this evil presents a threat to white Americans of goodwill. It poses a threat to Asians and to people of Latin America, to Black people, to every ethnic group in this country. It poses a threat to not only every group of people in this country, but it also poses a threat to other people in countries all around the world. And if we have just a small group of people that are committed to evil, that they know what they're doing, they choose to be evil, they choose this is the path they've chosen, then certain judgment is necessary. Certain judgment has to come about. It is part of nature, because at some point, when do you have to look at and say, okay, if I got gangrene in my hand, in order for the whole body to survive, we got to cut off that arm. We got to cut that hand off. At what point do you say that in order for us to survive as humanity and move forward, do we have to amputate the rotten limb? And this is, you look at America, you look at what's happening now, and it's like a choice is coming. And this choice is coming. And it's inescapable. You don't see any signs of repentance. You don't see any signs of attempts at reconciliation. You don't see any signs of any type of righteousness or truth. Just constant lying, constant evil, constant overstepping of authority, constant expressions of bigotry and hatred and xenophobia. And at what point do we have to recognize and understand that there is an abomination that the scripture talks about, refers to it as the abomination of desolation? And when do we recognize this, the existence of this abomination of desolation, and recognize that there is evil, and that in righteousness and in truth, this evil has to be stopped in order to preserve humanity? And this is so fundamental, it's so basic, that it's not only about the rights of Black people. It's not only about Black people being able to make progress. It's about humanity, and it's about the brotherhood of humanity. It's about building the beloved community. And so when I talk about the topic Black community, it is, for me, it is a important concept to understand the nature of Black community, because we live in an environment of inevitable mutuality. We are all interconnected, and we have to work toward building the beloved community. And our survival depends on our ability to make the right choices, to make the right decision when it comes to where we stand. Do we stand on the side of right, or do we stand on the side of wrong and evil? And we have to make a choice. And so I leave you with this thought, that which happened in the past and that which we believe happened in the past conditions the living present and therefore the future. So history is not a dead thing. It informs where we are now, and it informs our progress. And if we live a life that's built upon misinformation and half-truths and lies, and we believe those things rather than understanding what actually happened in the past, we'll be led astray. And this is why it's so important for us to study our history and understand the truth, to get a grip on the real world reality where we are and see what's coming down. Be blessed. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for taking the time to listen.